Dear listeners, welcome back to our sixth and last episode of our podcast, Invisible Wound. If you have not listened to the previous episode, please start there, as this is the second part of our talk with the wonderful Larissa Behrendt. Let's dive right back in. Larissa, in your novel After Story, you write this incredibly beautiful sentence. Trauma runs its own path. What does that mean in the Aboriginal context or in the Indigenous context?
Yeah, I feel like for me, the book is about the intergenerational trauma, and it's also about the slow burn of grief as well. And for me, I think of the way in which there's a way for everyone individually, the source of their trauma is unique. How it manifests is unique to them. How they deal with it is unique. And then its consequences are unique in each different case. Every person has a different path that their trauma will travel through that system of relationships and time frames. And yet, overall, there are things that are universal in how, as a community, we experience that trauma. And I think that in two ways. The first is if we look at the impact of the removal policy on our families, that has been a huge insertion of trauma, often across many generations, because the policy began really in the 1890s and didn't stop being a formal policy until 1969. So you are likely to find the policy impacting on several generations and then becoming cyclical. So we see children now being taken into state care from parents, grandparents who have had this same issue. So there's a policy that affects the whole community, and in that sense there's a shared experience under it. But I think it's really important to always understand how unique that is. So we have that collective experience of trauma because we have a similar experience with it. And then, we also have a collective sense of how we deal with that. I think one thing we're seeing now is an increase in the importance of understanding the storytelling and reconnecting back to culture and trying to repair those families and those communities. So there's a lot of work that goes on, for example, regenerating languages, re-engaging in cultural practices like weaving and possum cloak making. These aren't just a cultural practice that are done individually and help a person individually heal, but in our culture you do weaving and possum cloak making and you share language, of course, communally. So there are these processes that are going on now that we see where people are collectively dealing with that trauma. So I think it's very easy to sometimes think of this as a communal experience and a broad community experience, and within that we forget the individual trauma of a person and how very unique their experience is. So it feels to me like it's very important to keep remembering that as part of the healing process. So we really acknowledge what an individual person's own path and experience has been, and help them then with their healing and their way back to their family.
What, if I may ask, what was your process?
I think for me, I found my process through writing. That's a very easy answer in a way. My first novel, Home, was a dramatised account of really my grandmother's life as a child that was removed, and then my father's experiences in the home, and the third generation, which was sort of based on myself and my brother going back to that place. And I had that experience myself before I went overseas to study. My dad took me out to our traditional country, and I stood on the very spot where my grandmother had been physically removed from by the protection board when she was taken from her family. And it was a overwhelmingly powerful feeling of a circle being closed, that we'd come back to that spot and we were still First Nations people. And there was a very conflicting sense of what we had lost and what trauma had been created, and the members of our family we'd lost and who had been so damaged. But there was also a sense of, you know, pride in survival. And here was my father relearning the language and the totemic systems, and he became a quite significant cultural keeper. My father, when he returned home, he kept oral histories and family trees. So he helped many people. So I fictionalised that story. So for me, that was the first part of it. And then my father passed not long after my book came out, and he had said to me one night before he died, I was at his place and we'd had a late night, and he said to me, some of those things you wrote about in the book, they actually happened. Now, he never spoke to me about any abuse he might have experienced in the homes. I wrote a fictional story. I imagined that happened to the characters because there was obviously large reports done and lots of evidence given about that experience. He had never said that to me, but I imagined it in the book, in my fictional characters. And in saying that to me, I think it was the only time he ever admitted to anybody that he'd had that experience. And I felt the gift of having written that book for me was to be able to tell the story about my family and get through my own rage about what I'd seen happening. But it also helped him have a conversation with me I don't think he could have ever had. It wasn't a long conversation, but it was enough. And so my second book was really a book written about him after he passed away, which I feel was a real love letter that looked at him as a man who had come through a very difficult childhood and became a leader in his community, but at the same time was very flawed, and how his daughter came to terms with him. I think the theme of the book is that when you really love someone, you love them for everyone they are, including their flaws. So that was the second thing. So that was the second part of dealing with that, of feeling like there was a trauma in him that never got resolved, that it impacted on the rest of my family, particularly my mother. And we needed to find a way to process that. So for me, I have found writing to have been that in the past. And now that I'm older and I feel more cultural responsibility, I've become more active in those processes, like the possum cloak making. So at the moment I'm making the possum cloak for my brother, who's now the oldest cultural male in the family, because the men in our families have died young. He's not much younger than me, but he's taken on the kind of cultural role my father had. So making his cloak for him and telling his children his stories and putting that into his coat, and having my mother and my sister-in-law and my stepmother all work on the coat is a part of our family storytelling. So for me, it sort of shifted a bit, but I do now, I think, more deeply understand why cultural practice is a really important part of our healing.
The podcast is called Invisible Wound. What does it, which images come up for you, or thoughts or feelings when you thinking about collective transgenerational trauma?
You know, I think what is so evocative about the phrase for me is it does make me think of somebody like my father, who to the outward world was very charismatic, was a very eloquent man. He didn't get the education he aspired to because he was an Aboriginal child, so he wasn't taught past the age of 14, but he was always self-taught. We We had very little money when I was growing up, but we always had books in the house. He and my mother taught my brother and I to read at a very young age. So to the outside world, he was charismatic and wise and learned. He became culturally very learned, and privately he had a lot of wounds, and he was a very complex man. And it sort of makes me think of him, that it's the wound that people don't see because they see one side of a person. And these wounds go really deep. They are wounds from childhood, but they are wounds that are also inherited. And I think it's a very big part of our First Nations experience, that we've got the removal policy that has become a very big part of the experience of Aboriginal communities and families. That is a big wound. There's the history of dispossession. There's a range of impacts of being the subject of colonisation that many Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islanders, First Nations Australians argue is ongoing. Removal of children, over-representation. And those wounds are there. And they're hidden in this really important way too. Most of Australia doesn't see it. They think of these things as things of the past. We had a very important apology to stolen generations done by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2008, that it finally acknowledged that this was a policy of the past. And many Australians assumed at that time that this was history. So it's an invisible wound because it's something that's ongoing that many Australians still don't see.
Since doing this podcast, thus having to do with Australia, and of course having my own experiences in Germany, I wonder if for you, when you travel, if you also experience or think about the patterns of other nations in the way they deal with their pasts. How is that for you?
I'm always fascinated by the story that a nation tells itself about itself, because in lots of ways that's the big challenge for particularly white Australians. They've had huge debates here about whether there were massacres on the frontier or not, or whether there was a stolen generation. There's always pushback from people who don't want to hear these stories when they start to be told, who want to justify why things happened the way they were, or downplay them, or turn them back from stories into statistics. And they're never things that affect the way Aboriginal people see their history. They're really a debate between non-Indigenous Australians about the story they want to tell about their country. And so for me, I'm always fascinated by that. And one thing that my husband and I particularly do in this vein when we go to any place in Europe is see how they talk about World War II and what stories they tell about that. It's really interesting in terms of getting a sense of how the country tells its own history and what it says about that, and how much it will acknowledge and how it tells that story. I find it endlessly fascinating to compare it. I find museums and memorials interesting in terms of how they're telling a story and a narrative. And obviously there are many places in Europe now that continue to struggle with that. And the other thing I found very interesting the last time my husband and I were in Berlin was that we had a couple of people, because we love getting very bespoke tours and going to places and really digging into them. So we'll often do a tour with a historian or, an academic who has an interest, so that we can really dig into the history of a place and see it in a different way. And we had a couple of those guides say to us, I don't understand why Australians won't just acknowledge their past. And I find that endlessly fascinating as well. When I was living in America, I had people always saying to me, why is it so hard for Australians? And here you have a country that is racked with its history of slavery and its history of its treatment of Native Americans. And it's often easier for people to look at another country and say how sad that they can't face their history. At the same time, they're ignoring their own. I think it's an endlessly fascinating thing. I love storytelling as a tradition in my own culture, but I find it endlessly fascinating in other ways. National narratives are a very interesting space for me. I find them a source of much interest and amusement.
So going back to one of the big topics that are both really, really important in your film and in your novel, and After the Apology and an After Story, is the topic of shame, the feeling of shame. You know, you speak about that feeling of I'm not good enough, which, from what I understood, is such a big result of trauma. Could you say more to that?
And I guess I explore that concept in several different ways because it manifests in so many, doesn't it? There's the shame that people feel when they've had the state come and intervene in their families' lives and deem them to be neglecting their children or their grandchildren. That is an incapacitating shame. People feel so embarrassed about it. It stops them from being able to advocate for themselves. It takes very brave people to speak out during that time. There's a way in which the colonisation of a people means that stereotypes and narratives are told about them. Being bad parents is one of them. That's a trope that comes up all the time, which is why it becomes so quick for middle-class white people to look at Aboriginal people and assume there's bad parenting there. It's a very historic but a very contemporary narrative. But there's a whole range of other ways in which you know that you're being looked at as other, or if you are able to show talent, that you're then signalled out as an exception, not like the others. There's a whole range of ways in which, particularly as a child, you're registering that you're being seen as lesser, though you can't articulate it or understand it as a simple manifestation of a type of racism or racial superiority. So it's unusual to have been able to go through life as a young Aboriginal person in Australia and not have that. And I certainly felt it. And I felt that even though I was lucky enough to have parents who always instilled in me a pride about who I was. My mother is not First Nations. She's a white Australian, but she was always, from the start, imbuing in my brother and I a sense of pride about who we were, which went against her own upbringing, of what her parents thought. So she was quite extraordinary. So I was very lucky to have grown up in that. But I still, once I got outside of the house, it was a shock to me, really, the first time I realised that people thought Aboriginal people were inferior, because I didn't understand why they would think that, because I'd grown up in a house where we were all really proud of it.
How did you experience that? What happened?
Oh, in the schoolyard.
Yeah, tell me.
In the schoolyard, with people taunting me, and it being something that you were dirty and ridiculing you and throwing things at you. The name calling was the first thing, and that the use of the word black was that, and it's been an interesting thing for me, because I remembered that from the very first, from my early schooling, of being taunted for being Aboriginal. And then as I got older and became a lawyer and then went to Harvard, there was an element of the right-wing press here that particularly signalled me out, especially because I had the audacity to dye my hair blonde as a phase I went through, but that completely confused them. And so I got pilloried as a light-skinned Aboriginal person, as though I was they basically accused me of being a fraud, because as though I claimed to be Aboriginal. But the first time I'd ever felt that it was a negative was when white people did that. So it's this thing where you were black and so you were lesser, but as soon as you achieved, you were too white and a fraud. So these are the kind of messages that an Aboriginal person gets through their life. And I feel very privileged that I came from such strong family and such pride that I've always been able to put that in perspective. But I see it cripple other people, and that's what it's designed to do. It's designed to stop you from speaking out. It's designed to cower you. It's designed to make you doubt your ability to say something and to speak publicly. I mean, this is a usual thing of trying to shame women in public life. So, these are things that are done through a racial lens, and it's all designed to embarrass you and to shame you. One of the great rebellious things to do is to be audacious and not have shame about it. And luckily, I started it from a position of pride, so it's held me in good stead for some of those battles.
I would like to go deeper into the topic of structural racism. Could you speak more to how structural racism is being enabled in society in Australia?
I think there's structural racism in things like child protection. There's certainly structural racism in the criminal justice system. Mm-hmm. There is actually structural racism everywhere. You can go into an organisation. It's one of the things that, the academic team I work with does all the time, is we'll go and look at organisations and there is structural racism. Almost every institution built in this country has an inbuilt system of structural racism because of the assumptions made by the people who have created those systems. And it's always a telling sign that if all you're doing is tinkering around the edges and the outcome isn't changing, like with criminal justice system, we need more Aboriginal lawyers, or we need more Aboriginal judges, and still the overrepresentation increases. That is always the litmus test of structural racism. The real place where structural racism lies in Australia is in our Constitution. And It's a very benign-looking document. Nowhere does it say, that white people are superior. But it was a document that was written when it came into be the founding document of our country in 1901. That deliberately left out any protections against racial discrimination because it was intended that the first piece of legislation that went through wasn't actually about Aboriginal people. By that time, the assumptions were we were a dying race. But the first substantive laws that went through the Australian Parliament were immigration laws that entrenched the White Australia policy, so were designed to keep Chinese people out of Australia. So there was a deliberate sense of setting up a structure that allowed racial discrimination. So the only amelioration of that comes in 1975 through the legislation of a Racial Discrimination Act, so a piece of legislation that's intended to bring in the concept of racial equality or the prohibition on racial discrimination, relying on our obligations under the United Nations treaties and conventions. And that proves to be a false thing. It's been repealed 3 times, and in those 3 times were all at times when Aboriginal rights were being infringed upon by the federal government, and the federal government wanted to pass expressly racist laws, so it simply repealed the Racial Discrimination Act. So it's not much of a safeguard against racial discrimination if at the times when the protection is needed the most, the Parliament can simply get rid of its need to comply with that standard. So that therein is the example of how permeating the idea of racial discrimination is. It was interesting that one of those times was about the suspension of protections for heritage protection. Another was in relation to policies that were discriminatory for a range of reasons with a thing called the Northern Territory Intervention. but the other time was in relation to native title, and it suspended or erased Aboriginal rights to land. And interestingly, one of the few people that one of the first groups and loudest groups to join Aboriginal people in protesting those actions were the Jewish community, who understood that the attack on property was a harbinger of worse to come. So it's interesting how having those protections just as legislation and being able to then suspend them sends a message to many groups who've been subjected to terrible discrimination and are concerned about how vulnerable those protections are within the Australian system, even though we're held out as being one of the great liberal democracies of the world.
And it is true that 10-year-old children are allowed to be incarcerated.
That is true. There is a move now to raise that to the age of 12. Obviously, that's still short of the international convention, which says 14. But as we speak, there are still children as young as 10 being locked up in Australia. And a majority of those children are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander children, so they're First Nations children.
I have to say that seems, I mean, when I read that, I didn't know what to say anymore. The image of Australia on the outside and the reality on the inside seems so different.
Yes, and then, you know, I look back at how I was at 10. I imagine how traumatised I'd be. And the other disturbing thing is that majority of the children who are in prisons, in juvenile detention, are in out-of-home care. So they are actually wards of the state. So you have a higher chance of being locked up as a child if you're removed from your family. And part of that is because the sort of behaviour we exhibit when we're acting out at home, so you lose your temper and you punch a wall and cause damage, that would be treated in a disciplinary way within the family. If you do that and you're in out-of-home care, you can be charged with destruction of property. So your behaviour as a child is criminalised. So, you know, there's a huge intersection in my work in the criminal justice system and the child protection system in that juvenile justice space that's very concerning. And of course, once children go into an institution, particularly a juvenile detention centre at the age of 10, their chances of not being institutionalised or spending a lot of their adult life in institutions is diminishing.
It seems like it's a vicious cycle. A child is being removed from their family. It causes more trauma for the family. It causes trauma for the child. And then the child acts out. Is that what's going on? That is the cycle. Yeah, that is the cycle. And you have that in the context of the generations of having been removed. So people who've been removed as children have, you know, more challenges of being a parent. And, you know, there are many who are able to do that. You know, my father was a loving father, even though he'd been institutionalised from the age of 5. So it does happen, but that didn't mean he didn't have other forms of trauma that really did impact the family. So there are ways in which that becomes really a cyclical thing in terms of how people have to then try and rebuild a family when that's their family history. And that is very much the topic in After the Apology. You talk with different families. Now, let me ask you this. What I found so interesting, and I'd like to go a bit more in detail in how the film is made. It is a documentary, and yet you use so many different layers in visualizing or representing what I interpreted as trauma by emphasizing important sentences that certain protagonists of yours say on screen. Or, for instance, then there are moments where you also use animation. Could you tell us a little bit more about those artistic choices?
The use of the words on screen, I find as a way to emphasise the power of the word. And if a large part of the disempowering of the women in the film, in the system, was that they couldn't speak out about what was happening to them, being able to underline the power of their words and highlight particular words they're using by using text felt like it was a kind of bold way to amplify their ability to speak. And the use of animation was both artistic choice to, I follow a group of grandmothers through the arc of the film, the ob-doc element of it. And then I have some standalone vignettes of stories that complement what those grandmas are going through. And it was an artistic choice to visually have those vignettes done differently. But it was also a creative choice to get around a legal problem, which is that all jurisdictions in Australia, because child protection is a state issue, so the laws are state-based, which shows it's a systemic problem because child removal is an issue in every state of Australia. Mm-hmm. And all of those states have prohibitions on people being able to be identified if there is a child protection order in place. Now, that is because it's supposed to protect a child, but what it also means is if your child is being wrongfully removed, it takes away your ability to tell people your story because that order is in place. So through the use of using a rotoscope animation, I could have my collaborators in the film, the talent that's there, tell their stories in their own words and still hide their identity so that we were compliant with the law, but they could still reclaim their voice and tell their stories their own way.
Would you say consciously think on how to represent trauma, or did you just focus on the storytelling?
I always try to think of storytelling from a strengths-based approach. Mm-hmm. I like to look at the strengths of the people that I'm working with and that I'm writing about. Mm-hmm. So I acknowledge that there's trauma, but when somebody's telling their story, they're doing that from a position of showing strength, however deep their trauma is. So for me, strengths-based storytelling is how I describe my style of approach. And I don't think the women in After the Apology, although they had all been victims of injustice, see themselves as victims. I think they see themselves as fighters and as warriors. So I think the storytelling style we approached tries to do honour with that. So a large part of my collaborative process is to work with them about how the story wants to be told. So they have a lot of agency and control over that. Mm-hmm. And there is always the wanting to tell what's happened to them, but there is also a strong part of their story is the action they've taken and their agency in reclaiming that. I also think deeply about who I put in the story. Mm-hmm. So the women I chose for After the Apology were all women who I knew had spoken publicly at rallies or meetings about what had happened to them, so that I knew that if there was backlash for them telling their stories from right-wing commentators, for example, that they had been practiced in being in public. Mm-hmm. Some of my women who were in the animations hadn't had quite the same profile, though all of them had spoken publicly in one way or another. So there's a way of being really careful about whose story you choose to tell. And there was actually one grandmother that I worked with who I did actually do quite a bit of filming with, but by the time it came to put the film together, several things had happened and she was in quite a difficult place, and we agreed that it wasn't time for her to publicly tell her story, and I feel like that was the right thing to do. We did that collaboratively, but it was correct. She had a very powerful story to tell, but it wasn't the right time. and we just had to respect that. And it was the right thing to do for her, that she deal with the other things in her life, and then the time to tell her story would come at another time. So, I think there's a lot that you have to think before you start filming. There's a lot you have to think about when you're editing in terms of being true to the story and, protecting the authenticity and integrity of your participants, of your collaborators. And then there's a large part of using the film for their advocacy. After the Apology was a film that was mostly used in terms of its impact by either the grandmothers themselves or by our community-controlled organisations. It wasn't a film where I went around and spoke about the stories in there. From the start, when we were making the film, it was a vehicle for the advocacy for the women in the film. So the film's become a way of them being able to further their own advocacy for change and their own work in supporting other families that this is happening to. So that's, as a filmmaker, that's a wonderful life for your film to have, that you can gift it over to people who continue to work in that space and use it very effectively.
So is there a worry to be represented only as a victim? And what is the worry behind it? Or is that something that I misunderstood?
Oh, yeah, no. I think there's a lot of storytelling that loves to dwell on the trauma and loves to dwell on the hardship and the victimhood. And I think that is often mostly storytelling done from outside our community. Because if you sit in our community, what you're most struck by is how strong it is. We are the world's oldest living culture. Our culture has been around for 65,000 years, and that is an incredible feat, but nothing is more impressive than how it survived through the last over 200 years since 1788. Nothing is more impressive than that. And there is a lot of resilience. There is a lot of love. The characters of Della and Auntie Elaine encapsulate that kind of strength and community spirit and the ability to bring people together. Auntie Elaine brings the characters in the book together even after she's left this earth. And even in the film, women like Hazel and Sue Ellen are leading an amazing charge of challenging bureaucrats and challenging lawmakers. These are women who are warriors. They've had terrible things happen to them, and they are fighters. To tell their story just as though they're victims does them a great disservice. You need to be able to let them talk about what has happened to them that has been so unjust, but you also need to celebrate their resilience and their fight and their ability to bring the community with them. These are women who are extraordinary in the way in which, through living lives that they would never have thought would have seen them do this, have now become huge spokespeople for people who have had these things happen to them. I think that's amazing. I would hope that when you see a film like After the Apology, you're shocked by what you see, but you are inspired by the women who are in there. And to me, that's a very big part of it. I find it problematic when films only look at what the problem is and they don't offer a solution and they don't highlight what kind of agency is being expressed by people who are fighting against that system. We are not laying down and letting this happen to us. We are fighting it, and we owe it to the people that this happens to really celebrate their resilience. It's extraordinary. I find it inspiring.
Absolutely. I just find it also very important to explain. And you were saying, you say that most of the time it's people from the outside coming in. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, whether they just don't see the resilience or they don't understand how complex the narrative is. I don't know if they feel some comfort by being able to tell a story that is about, oh, look how poorly treated Aboriginal people are. I can't explain why a non-Indigenous person finds that an interesting or ethical way to tell a story, because I don't have that mindset, but I see it done and it troubles me. And it's certainly not a form of storytelling I would ever want to emulate. I think the strengths-based approach in my work is something that it kind of defines me as a storyteller.
Mm-hmm. Is that something you would say is part of Indigenous culture in general? Or is that you?
I feel like it's something I've learnt from my culture. I think you don't survive the apocalypse of a colonisation that we did with smallpox, dispossession of land, people taking away your right to speak your language and practice your culture, taking your children. You don't survive that without resilience. And the other thing about it too is there's enormous humour in the community. That is another way people deal with trauma, is they find a way to laugh. They don't laugh about the trauma, but they find a way to find the things in life that can give you laughter. And that's a big way, part of the way that I see people in my community deal with healing. Laughter is really important. A sense of humour is really important. The women in my community I admire the most all have wicked senses of humour. It's part of their equipment. It's part of their subversiveness. It's part of the way in which the system never defeats them. So I think, you can't grow up in the space I grew up in and not see that and marvel at it. Certainly, of course, it shaped me. These were people I admire, and I try to emulate them and learn from them. So I feel like it's kind of, in a way, I feel like it's come into my DNA.
So where are you heading now? What is the next fight you're putting on?
Well, I have a couple of projects underway. I want to do a book of legal essays that sort of actually start to talk more deeply about the issues of systemic racism in a way that explores that from my own experiences working in the system. So there's a bit of writing to be done. I have a film project that's looking at Indigenous cultures, which is, I guess, a celebration of the resilience and the strength. And I'm also in some early discussions with community-controlled organisations about doing something actually about intergenerational trauma. And, of course, as you know, that will be from a strengths-based approach. So there's a bit of filmmaking, a bit of celebration, a bit of legal work. My legal team continues to work on important cases, so I've still got some work to do with them. And we've just taken a case to the United Nations for a death in custody. So we're still trying to find ways to challenge the Australian legal system any way we can.
And what is your dream?
Oh, I mean, I guess I would love to see my community celebrated as the central part of Australian life. Aboriginal people are still treated as though we're on the margins of Australia. But this is the culture that's been here for 65,000 years. I'd love to see a time when Australians could understand that differently and see themselves as a part of that, not by appropriating it, but you can't live on this country and not be connected to that history of place. Mm-hmm. So I'd really like to see that. I mean, that's a hope. I mean, I think in many ways we're going through a period where we're looking at challenges. There's the challenge about climate, which of course is quite extreme in Australia with our already quite arid climate here. European land practices have further increased threats to climate, to waterways, the ecosystems. We see intense fires because country isn't looked after the way Aboriginal people would fire farm it. So there's that crisis, and then of course there's the challenge to liberal democracy around the world. These are, in a way, I feel like there are bigger challenges to the next generations now than maybe there even were to my generation. So my my hope is we can equip the next generation for those challenges.
Is there anything else you feel like I did not ask, and that is really important that you wish to share?
Oh, no, I think you've been very comprehensive and we've really dug in deep. You've made me think more deeply about things than I've had to in a long time.
Okay. Well, then I have to say...
In a good way. I've learned a lot.
Well, thank you very much. I've learned a lot and I continue to learn a lot. And I'm very, very thankful and grateful for this incredible talk.
Okay, thanks so much. Lovely chat. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Dear listeners, I hope you've had a lot of insights throughout the podcast series. And I hope that our guests inspired you to look at Aboriginal culture and see it for its incredible resilience. Hopefully, this made you curious to follow their stories and their works as artists. Thank you to our guests for your trust. That is Shannon Smith and his awesome work as a hip-hop artist. To Tanya Crampton-Larking, so looking forward to reading your next book. Uncle Boydie and Abe Swartz, let's keep the incredible story of William Cooper in our hearts. If you have a chance to watch Ablaze by Tiriki Onus and Alec Morgan, do not miss it, so you can watch the story about the incredible Bill Onus. And last but not least, thank you to Larissa Behrendt for sharing her incredible ideas and works with us. Dear listeners, this podcast would not exist without Amcha, who believed in this project as a possibility to discuss collective transgenerational trauma. This was Invisible Wound, and my name is Sharon Ryba-Kahn. Thank you for listening.